about it. 30% will report experiencing some form of sexual harassment at some point during their career. And also there's evidence of widespread disparities in achievement, in salary. We'll talk a little bit about some of that. And I know Suzette will mention some of that as well. But honestly, when you compare the achievements between female and male physicians, there are gaps in achievement at almost every level. So there are fewer female full professors. Professors are less likely to achieve leadership positions. They're less likely to be asked to give grand rounds. Female physicians have almost half as much time allocated to research and instead have more time allocated towards teaching and clinical responsibilities. And teaching in particular, I can say from a lot of personal experience, is often unfunded and therefore increases the time and burden of the female physician's work without necessarily increasing compensation. Female physicians are half as likely to be associated with clinical trials. They're a third less likely to get NIH grants. They have almost half the rate of publication, and they're also less likely to be cited as first or last authors on a publication. So on almost every level, there is a gap in achievement. And there are some different studies that have really tried to narrow down what are some of the ways in which we are failing to make these achievements. And one of the areas is communication. So there's been a lot of research really looking at the ways that female physicians, starting all the way at the level of medical students, communicate. And the good news is, honestly, female physicians do engage in a lot of positive behaviors. They engage in more psychosocial dialogue. They're more likely to engage in preventative care. They engage in more patient-centered behaviors, asking the patients open-ended questions and giving patients more time to respond. They also engage in active listening. On average, patient visits with female physicians take 1 to 2 minutes longer than patient visits with male physicians. And female physicians are associated with fewer malpractice claims. So all of that is good news. And yet, despite all of these differences, patient satisfaction is higher with male physicians. So the biggest study that was done to this to date looked at 53,000 online surveys. So they developed an AI algorithm that collated all this data from multiple different websites, and they looked at the data from 53,000 online ratings of physicians across multiple different specialties. And they found in essentially every domain, male physicians are rated higher. Interestingly enough, the lowest satisfaction was seen when female patients were paired with female physicians, which is something that I found very counterintuitive. I, personally often see a female physician, so I actually expected that the relationship and dynamic would be exactly the opposite. But apparently this is the pairing that is most likely to be associated with poor satisfaction. And the same AI study that looked at this 53,000 different ratings found that some of the 10 most commonly non-medical words that were used to describe female physicians, amongst those words, the top 10 words that were used to describe female physicians, the words rudely and judgmental frequently made an appearance. Now, it's worth noting, this was not all sunshine and roses for male physicians. Male physicians, their top 10 words included the word jerk. So it's not all female physicians who are being criticized in these online rating systems, but as you can see, in essentially every domain, female physicians are underappreciated. And that's despite some of the things that we see that suggest that in some domains, they're outperforming their male colleagues. There are a few things, however, that some studies have suggested can improve patient satisfaction with female physicians. Some of these, I think, are very easily achievable, like increasing eye contact. It's very easy to increase eye contact, and apparently this does improve the connection that patients feel with a female physician. Now, some of these, I'm going to tell you quite honestly, I do not have a soft voice. I'm a loud person, and I would find it very challenging to speak with a softer voice, even if I frequently reminded myself to do so. Similarly, leaning forward is something that some female physicians may not feel comfortable with. But these are things that have been associated with increased patient satisfaction. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that in general, female physicians' scores improve if they're measured immediately after a visit. If there's a delay between when the patient is surveyed and when they see their physician, the female physicians are often evaluated less well. Other things that in general contribute to more harsh evaluations of female physicians. So if a patient perceived that the female physician had a very structured interview, that was evaluated harshly. If the female physician asked more questions, I honestly don't know what to do about that question or that issue, or if they use their computer or tablet while talking. And again, this is an omnipresent issue that I think physicians, both male and female, struggle with now with the move to electronic medical record systems. So in general, there are some basic tips that all physicians, both male and female, can use as they approach their patients to try to improve their overall communication skills and communication styles. One is to smile and keep good eye contact. Again, this is important for both male and female physicians. And again, this can be a challenge with the electronic medical record system. There's a tendency that all of us have to look down at our computers, look down at the keyboard as we're typing. But unfortunately, when we do this, patients perceive us as not paying sufficient attention to them. And this can be evaluated harshly. Another important and kind of interesting thing that I often see amongst our female residents and students is the tendency for what we sometimes refer to as upspeak. So sometimes we have this tendency when we're talking to speak in an upward inflection at the end of our voice. I saw a 46-year-old patient with epilepsy. If you start speaking like that so that the end of your statements and the end of your phrases have an upward inflection relative to the way that your statements begin, it makes you sound uncertain, it makes you sound anxious, and in general, people are less likely to take you seriously. And this is something that we can all make a concerted effort to avoid. This is also something that is a little bit more common with women. Another thing that can improve the ability to communicate and improve our ability to convey particularly serious news to our patients is if we take the time to pause after our statements. So we all have pressures in terms of the number of patients that we need to see over the course of a day, but taking the time, trying not to rush, can improve the way that our messages are received. Also, and again, this is something that I think intuitively we all know that we should do, but sometimes do anyway. Pay attention to your use of filler words. You know, like, hey, Everybody uses them. It is part of our common way of communicating, but when you use frequent filler words, it makes you sound less certain. And again, unfortunately, female physicians are more likely to be judged harshly for this than their male colleagues. It's important to keep the message focused. And another thing, and there's a lot of research about this is particularly true for female physicians. Do not apologize unless you've genuinely made a mistake. Don't apologize if you are running 5 minutes behind. Do not apologize if the patient feels that they did not take their blood pressure in the way they prefer to have it be taken. If you are not the person who made a mistake, do not assume responsibility for the mistake that was made. There is an increased tendency amongst females and female physicians to assume responsibility for things over which you have no control. And in particular, if you start assuming responsibility for these things, and also if the thing is something that you have no control over and will not be able to prevent from happening in the future, this will engender resentment and disappointment in your patients. Your patients will be frustrated in the future if you fail to correct your mistake. Now, obviously, if you make an honest mistake, if you give the patient wrong information, if you write a prescription incorrectly, you should definitely apologize for that. But if you were not the person at fault, do not apologize. In addition to the issues in the way that we communicate between ourselves and our patients, there's issues in the ways that professionals communicate with one another. So over the course of a 12-month period, more than half of female physicians felt that they experienced workplace discrimination. And this discrimination comes at multiple levels, sometimes multiple levels simultaneously. This can be in the level of patient interactions, this can be at the level of coworkers, and this can be at the level of administrators and supervisors, which is the most common. About 1 out of 6 female physicians brought complaints of discrimination, and that is always your right to draw attention to the discrimination that you're experiencing. This can sometimes lead to positive changes, but it is worth noting in this study that came out in 2018, 28% of female physicians felt that when they did bring complaints of discrimination, that it led to a worse workplace situation, and only 8% felt like it improved their workplace situation. So when you do bring complaints of discrimination, it is always important to look at the potential repercussions of that complaint and whether or not there are any opportunities for anonymity in your complaint. It is also worth noting there are very few studies that really systematically address the differences between the interprofessional interactions between male coworkers and female coworkers. We do have a little bit of information. We do know, for example, that female physicians are slightly less likely to be selected for grand rounds, even amongst neurologists. So 33% of neurology faculty are female, only 26% of speakers are women. Another interesting fact that's come to light recently is that during the process of introducing speakers, individuals are much more likely to use the full titles for male speakers. So this is such and such, he is a physician who is an associate professor at such and such university, and they're more likely to refer to the female speakers by the first name or without use of their title. Another interesting fact that has come to light recently is that there are differences in the ways that letters of recommendation are written between men and women. So for males, the letters are more likely to include words like superb, intelligent, exceptional, future leader. For females, they are more likely to include words like compassionate, calm, delightful. Now, again, all of these are positive words, but in terms of selling somebody on a professional level, I think most of us can agree that the words that are often used to describe men are more likely to lead to successful employment in the future. More data, again, there's a lot of research about letters of recommendation amongst physicians. Female physicians in general get 16% shorter letters. They are 4 times less likely to have letters that contain references to leadership positions or titles. For example, chief resident, director of the EMG lab. Female physicians are almost twice as likely to have some type of doubt-raising language in their letter. So something that is perhaps damning with faint praise. Female physicians are also 6 times more likely to have some type of reference to their personal life in their letter. So one of my former colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, Catherine Davis, God bless her, she is a mother to 2 sets of twins. And she was not too long ago interviewed for an article that was supposed to be about her research accomplishments. And this article was featured in Neurology Today. And when the article was finally published, rather than focusing on her research accomplishments or her R01 grant, the article focused on her role as a mother and on her twins and how she was balancing her personal life and her professional life. That is not something that happens in general with men. In general, letters of recommendation for women are 4 times less likely to reference their research or their publications. And again, as you look through this, think to yourself, because one day, if you are not already, all of you will be in a position to write letters of recommendation. So make sure that none of you are the person who references someone's personal life or leaves out references to someone's research or publications. For better or worse, being a female and being a physician can also lead to a lot of challenges with family life. So maternity leave is one of the things that often creates conflict. The mean length at the top 20 medical schools across the country for maternity leave is 8.6 weeks. This is despite the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 12 weeks of maternity leave. It is also worth noting that a third of our top 20 medical schools require that the coverage be through disability or sick leave rather than granting automatic maternity leave. And perhaps even more concerning, many universities have constraints or discretionary benefits related to maternity leave. And this disadvantages women because when you make some aspect of maternity leave discretionary, many women feel like they're going to be less likely to take the full benefits because there will be a negative perception of them if the full benefits are taken. This is also an important issue that many individuals fail to consider when it comes to contract negotiation. So less than 30% of female physicians' contracts mention maternity coverage, even amongst reproductive age women. Gender also creates its own intrinsic issues within female physicians and their families. And there is a perception that female physicians are expected to do it all and have it all. And unfortunately, what this often leads to is increased burnout. So on average, relative to their male counterparts, female physicians have 8.5 hours more of household responsibilities. Male physicians also are much more likely to have a spouse who works part-time. So 90% of male physicians have a spouse who does not work or who works part-time. That is different from female physicians, where only 45% of female physicians have a spouse who works part-time or who does not work. More than 3/4 of department chairs in a recent survey said that for their female physicians, household work was a barrier to their physician's achievement. And perhaps all of the stress between personal and professional responsibilities may result in the fact that female physicians have an increased likelihood of divorce relative to both the general population and to their male colleagues. So there's a lot of different potential solutions to some of these problems. I'm not going to go into this too much. I know that Dr. LaRoche is also going to talk about this. But when it comes to issues of family and responsibilities, there are a couple of things that I would encourage everyone to consider. First and foremost, it's important to make sure that you have a physician network that you are connected with, whether that's within your department or institution, or within an organization or online. It is important to talk to other people who are going through something similar to what you were experiencing. For many individuals, exploring flexible or part-time opportunities is a great idea. And I think that the recent pandemic has opened many people's eyes to the possibility of increasing work from home opportunities. And then there is a lot of literature that says that whenever possible, outsourcing non-essential tasks can lead to an improvement in your happiness. There was a really interesting TED Talk that I listened to recently that said that money that is spent on activities that free up your time, so money spent on laundry services, meal delivery, house cleaning, nanny services, anything that gives you more free time, not just for work, but for yourself, is one of the best ways that you can increase your overall happiness. And then, of course, on an institutional level, it's important to advocate for institutional change. That means advocating for 12 weeks of paid maternity leave, increasing opportunities for flexible leave or part-time options, making sure that every place has a lactation room that is actually available. And I don't mean some creepy, nasty closet where you're sharing space with mops and brooms and stuff that really is inappropriate, an actual lactation room. On-site daycare is something that I think would be incredibly important and is often unavailable at many institutions. And then increasingly, there are more and more opportunities for time sharing at some institutions. And that's going to lead me to the last topic that I'm going to discuss before handing off to Suzette, wellness and burnout. So wellness and burnout are so common amongst neurologists. We unfortunately have a higher rate of burnout than other subspecialties, 60% relative to the 35 to 50% of other areas. Most of you know that burnout is this triad of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a sense of low personal accomplishment, not feeling a sense of personal validation from the things that you do. And there's an interesting study that came out from the Netherlands recently that said that it's possible that amongst physicians, men and women, although they both experience burnout at relatively similar rates, may experience burnout slightly differently. So women often experience the emotional exhaustion of burnout earlier, and the depersonalization, the cynicism, the lack of interest in their patients, that comes a little bit later. With men, the opposite phenomena is often true. Depersonalization, cynicism, lack of interest in patients is often one of the first manifestations of burnout, followed by emotional exhaustion. And one of the interesting things that was also noted in this study is that men overall have less of a reduction in their sense of personal accomplishment than women do. Women are often very quick to dismiss their accomplishments and not to take credit for the things that they do. And that is perhaps less true for their male colleagues, even in the midst of personal challenges. There have been 13 studies, and all of them have found that females are a little bit more likely to experience the emotional exhaustion component of burnout than men. Men are more likely to experience the depersonalization than women. And again, men were less likely to develop that decreased sense of personal accomplishment. So again, what you can do when you see burnout in others, be supportive, because one of the most important things to recognize is that criticism will worsen someone's sense of accomplishment. And then strategize with them on ways to reduce workload, increase the sense of autonomy, and then refer to mental health services as appropriate. So I want to give special thanks before I conclude to all of the folks that I have worked with, the people who have set the stage for me in my career. So folks like Susan Herman, to whom I am eternally indebted, and of course, Gloria Galloway and Suzette, who will be talking with you next. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch to Suzette. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Will we have time at the end? I have a feeling there'll be a lot of questions.
I hope so. I had actually thought that was going to be shorter, but sorry.
I'll talk fast.
Oh, it was great. I just want to make sure we find time. So I don't want to cut you short, Suzette. So keep going.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I should say Dr. LaRoche and Dr. Schmidt.
Okay. Can you see my screen there? We all good? Okay. Well, we always want to start with disclosures, right? So my most important disclosures, I'm a woman and I have experienced gender bias. I think that's important to start off with.
You have the presentation is in that slide mode where like we see both the next slide and the current slide. Do you know what I mean?
Let me fix that.
It's not a huge deal, but.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. I had this happen and
display settings.
Yeah, try. Yeah.
That worked. Whatever you had just done.
It's back.
Random chance, but let's do it. Okay.
It's still doing it, but it's fine. Just go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that. You get to see the next slide.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people have been talking about this as the decade of the woman. And I think particularly when we talk about politics, that's certainly true. We've got more women in Congress and Senate than ever. And honestly, I still get emotional when I think about the fact that we're going to have a female vice president in just a couple of months. But then I question, why did it take this long? Why, especially in this country? And then we think about what about healthcare, academics, in STEM fields, where I feel like we're far behind our accomplishments in politics. So what I want to do, I want to take a little bit of a step back. Sarah's done a great review of some of the objective data that demonstrates gender gap, but I want to talk a little bit about implicit gender bias. We'll talk about salary gap, and then talk quickly about some solutions to the problem. So quick story, many of you might have heard this before. A father and his son were both in a car accident. The father was killed and the son was rushed to the hospital where he needed an emergency operation to save his life. The surgeon examined the boy before the operation and said, "I cannot operate on this child. He is my son." Now, if any of you took just a second to try to figure that out and think, how could this be? Then you're operating under the societal assumption that the surgeon must be his father and not his mother. So I think implicit gender bias is a lot of the root of the problem of the gender gap, and we could have a whole lecture on this. And a lot of this work has come out of Stanford. The definition of implicit gender bias is the unconscious attribution of particular qualities based on gender. These are stereotypes based on learned association and are largely socialized from birth. Of course, I don't know about you, but I don't tend to sit around in meetings thinking about shopping and stilettos and such. So the other issue is that often these stereotypes are based on very false assumptions. And I think this is a fascinating field of study. If you're interested, there is more information on Project Implicit. It's at the harvard.edu website. There's a series of implicit association tests there, not just looking at gender, but other discriminatory groups. And I think it's a very interesting field. But just kind of sticking with the idea of implicit gender bias, it influences decision making, and some of this work is like I mentioned earlier, out of Stanford. So we use bias in decision making as sort of a cognitive shortcut, and that's not always a bad thing. In medicine, we use cognitive shortcuts that help us arrive at a diagnosis correctly much of the time. But when we use that to characterize people by gender or race, then that leads to expectations that can lead to improper evaluation. So in the end, you get errors in decision making, and you could misidentify some of the best talent. So for example, males are automatically considered for leadership roles despite lack of experience in leadership. On the contrary, females might be automatically assumed to be best in a contributor or supportive role, again, despite evidence that that female has significant leadership experience. And then, of course, the errors in decision-making can lead to errors in hiring practices. So this is a fairly old study, but the same CV of a recent psychology graduate was sent to a group of psychology faculty. Half of them had the CV with a male name, Howard, at the top. The other half received a CV that had the name Heidi at the top. And 70% of those CVs, the same CV, were received as favorable if they had the male name at the top. For the female Heidi, less than half were considered favorable for hire. And in fact, the ones with Heidi at the top they had requested verification of the publications and wanted to actually get copies of the teaching evaluation. So the woman was under scrutiny, like they didn't believe her academic accomplishments and asked for backup. And then this is just a model that looks at when we introduce this implicit bias. In this model, it looks at just 1%. If we just look at 1% bias condition, it doesn't take you too many levels of promotion until we've only got 1/3 of women at the top of leadership positions. So what are some of the solutions? And Sarah already talked a little bit about conversation, the importance of communication. So do we just need to change the conversation? So this says, that's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. And how many of us have experienced this? And not only as women, but as any minority group. And this still happens today. Sarah already spoke to this a little bit, is there's certainly a language of gender. So communal language involves the word we, and women are more likely to use communal language. So that portrays a supportive role, team player, collaborative, caring, thoughtful, whereas men are more likely to use the agentic language of I, that portrays a person that's more independent, confident, ambitious, or outspoken. So one tactic or solution is, do we just think about changing our language. And Sarah already spoke to that a little bit, thinking about women thinking about themselves more in the concept of I. Now, and I'm sure we're all familiar with Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. This has been a very popular movement. And I think there's definitely a lot that we can learn from these women in positions of leadership. This is Jill Flynn out of Harvard that has made some very practical suggestions of how to be heard in a meeting. So one thing is to meet with people prior to the meeting, so you understand maybe where they're going to be coming from in the meeting, particularly if the topic's going to be contentious. Be prepared, show up early, don't rush in late. And then think about the power of informal conversation, like right before those few minutes, like right before the meeting or right at the end. And, you know, certainly the days of like Wednesday afternoons at the golf course are, I think, largely gone. But I started thinking about this and paying attention to this informal conversation when I walk into a meeting. And I have found, just my own personal experience, that men are much more likely to, in the first few minutes before the meeting starts, be talking about sports or the golf game and such. Women are less likely to do that. And then there's less connection, you know, during the actual course of the meeting. And maybe not so much now on Zoom, but pre-pandemic, when you walk into a meeting, there's the large conference table in the middle of the room, right? And then there's the chairs around it against the wall. Okay. How often as a female have you walked into a room and then chosen the seat up against the wall? Okay. Instead, sit at the table. If your place is at the table, sit at the table. And then plan ahead. You can plan ahead and prepare power comments, or think about, you know, what you're going to contribute to that meeting. So certainly these things can help us be heard more during meetings. But I think the other side of that is, if we just feel like the answer is to lean in, well, whose responsibility is that? That puts the onus on the women. That means it's our problem to fix. It means we just need to do more. So I don't think that's the entire solution. What about reducing interruptions? So this new term, manterruption, a kind of colloquial. Studies have shown that men interrupt women about 1/3 more than they interrupt men. And so there's different approaches that you can take. There's assertive tactics. So if you watch the VP debate, you heard Kamala Harris to Mike Pence, I am speaking. She did that several times as she was interrupted. Before that, Maxine Waters in a congressional hearing, I reclaim my time. I'm sure you've probably seen that on the news. So one strategy is to ignore and you just keep talking. And you can confront your interrupters either before or after the meeting, but this can certainly work. Assertive tactics can certainly help you get your voice heard and get your message across. The downside of that is that some studies have shown that assertive tactics have led to females being viewed less favorably, although that's unfair, but that is true. And so another approach could be, it's called the pause or preempt approach. Instead of assertiveness, tactics like, I would like to finish my thought before I take questions or comments. Or to the male who's interrupting or tends to interrupt, can I ask you a question, to get that male interrupter to at least pause, listen to your question, and then allow them time to comment back. So is the answer, we've talked about in implicit bias, in socialization. So is the answer just to socialize women to become more like men? That says, do you ever worry you've had to sacrifice your femininity to succeed in the male business world? Well, I think Sarah gave us some very good reasons why that's not the answer, is just to socialize women to be like men. We know that women can be better listeners and communicators, spend more time with our patients. Organizational research has shown significant benefit by having diversity in leadership. And finally, you know, at the cost of losing ourselves. So socialization to become more like more men some of those tactics might work during the meeting, but I don't think that is, you know, the global answer. So kind of switching gears here, and aside from being heard and having our place at the table, I think really one of the most kind of prominent and objective measures of the gender gap is the fact that we get paid less. Now, there's certainly been many studies in healthcare, outside healthcare, that have shown this over the last few years. A few years ago with the ACNS, we wanted to look at impact of salary on gender within neurophysiology itself. So this is a survey that we did. We had 125 men and 50 women complete the survey. They were all primary neurophysiologists. And so with 2/3 of the survey folks being male and only 1/3 being female, this is what you'd expect the salaries to come out as equal. Unfortunately, we saw that there were more women getting paid at less at the lower end of the scale, fewer men being paid at the lower end of the range, and really much more dramatically at the higher end of the salary range, a significant difference between male and female salaries. Now, one thing is, number one, we start out lower, we're hired in lower, and then we certainly don't acclimate to those higher salary levels. Now, this was all practice types. This included academic and non-academic practices. But if you think about it, I think one of the reasons for the big difference here is who in neurology makes more than 300,000? Chairs, people in administration. And I think we had too small of a group to control for that. I think that's one of the significant factors in this. We aren't seeing women at those top tiers of neurology and neurophysiology. And Sarah already alluded to this, this concept of the motherhood penalty when she talked about maternity leave, but it also is true for salary. And this is another study from a few years ago. They looked at salaries and favorability of female parents and versus male parents. They also looked at women and men without children, but the biggest significance here is that the female parent was offered significantly less salary and was viewed more favorably. So women with children deemed less competent, less committed. To which one woman replied, and I think this is a great quote, "I had a baby, not a lobotomy." So we really need to fight for equity in salaries. So how can we close the compensation gap? Well, it's all about transparency. So there's a couple different ways we can go about this. Number one, if you're in the process of evaluating a contract, gather as much salary data as you possibly can. So many of you are probably familiar that AAN has done salary surveys for the past several years. And if you are a member and you've contributed to that survey, you can get access to that data. If you don't have access to it, ask one of your colleagues if they can share that data with you. Most healthcare positions for physicians, salaries are determined in large part by what's called the MGMA fair market value. Most institutions have access to this data. They have fair market value salaries based on region, rank, and the type of practice that you're joining. And so a lot of times salaries are determined based on this MGMA fair market value. And so if you're being offered a contract and you get offered a salary, ask them where that salary came from. What fair market value are they using? And it doesn't hurt to ask them to disclose how they came or arrived at that fair market value. They can always say, no, I'm not going to tell you. But if they say that they're not going to show you where they arrived at your fair market value, that should make you suspicious. And this is really important. I think I wasn't even aware of this till a few years ago, but most public universities have open access database, and you can easily online see the salaries of faculty at public universities. So I'm in the middle of a career change, and I'm going to be joining UNC in the next few months. The first thing I did when I got my contract offer is I went online and I pulled up the UNC faculty salary database, and I found that there was a male colleague that was at my same rank that I was being hired in at, and he was making the exact same salary that I was being offered. And so that reassured me that what I was being offered was fair and equitable. And I think that's really powerful. It's important to be aware of compensation models. So when you're hired in, or if you're already hired in, know the details of the productivity metrics, know the bonus structure and how you're going to be paid. If you're doing significant administrative work, then you should get administrative time or administrative pay. And I think, women often agree to do administrative tasks. And then we kind of think about, oh, how are we going to get paid for that later? That needs to be negotiated up front, especially if it's a significant amount of your time. And then compensation is linked to promotion. So understand exactly the promotion criteria at your institution, and understand, how that's linked to your salary. I remember when I was promoted from assistant to associate professor when I was at Emory, I anxiously awaited my next paycheck to see what my raise was going to be. Sadly, to find out it was the same. I thought there must have been a mistake. And so I emailed the chair, and several conversations later, it got corrected. But that was me, not understanding ahead of time what the promotion criteria and how that was linked to my salary, and being aware of that. And then finally, I think it's important for us to all be aware of our worth and not to underestimate our worth. And I know women are probably a lot more likely to underestimate our own worth than men. Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit about how important professional societies can be in closing the gender gap. And I want to use ACNS as an example. So really the society I'm most familiar with. So probably this is the 1950s. This was the whole society. Really great mustache here. But probably pretty similar to most medical professional societies back in the 50s. This is Sarah's slide that she loaned me. And if we look at the number of presidents over the years, I actually am quite amazed that there was a female president back in 1954, but then there was 20 years until the second female president. When Dr. Sue Herman was president in 2012, that was when I was first elected to council, but she and I were the only two women on council. And a year after that, she rotated off the council, and I was the only woman on council for the next few years. But you notice a trend here over the last couple of years. Things are getting better, and that was not accidental. So around 2015 and 2016, the society made a concerted effort to increase number of female speakers and moderators in sessions. And you can see that this was quite effective. So over the years, now we have more than 70% of sessions have female speakers in them. And there's been a rise in female speakers and moderators in the society. We still have a way to go. This is only 30%. So we need more than one female speaker per session, right? But there's been a significant increase with that concerted effort. And then how does that lead to more people at the top? So when you have more female speakers and committee members, then that leads to more course directors and committee chairs down the road. More committee chairs means more female council members. And then eventually, as you can see, the trend in our society, increase in female leadership. And this happened very quickly. As you noted, it was just a few years ago that the society decided to make this a priority. And then this is how the leadership looks as of this year. So right now we have almost 50% of the leadership of the society are women. So it's been quite successful. And then, so how does that translate to success back at home? Okay, so we looked at how that can translate to success within the society. But when you have more female speakers, of course, there's more opportunity for collaboration. When there's more collaboration among institutions, it leads to an increase in publications. And of course, from there, there's promotion. And not only that, of course, when you have more opportunities to serve in leadership of a society, then that can lead to promotion as well. And I know this was this played a significant role in my ability to be promoted over the years as being able to be involved in leadership of this society. And then I just want to say, I think about as women who often might direct, of course, that we don't need to apologize or feel bad about having an all-female or female predominant symposium. There have been male predominant symposia or exclusively male symposia for decades, okay? We're just now getting to the point where we sometimes have female predominant symposiums. So this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Valia Rodriguez from Havana. And a few years ago, she approached me, she said, look, I want to increase knowledge of ICD-EG monitoring in Havana and throughout Latin America. How can we do this? And so we decided the best way to do that was to gather a group of folks to put on annual symposia. And so we sought out the best experts who we thought were the best teachers who would make good international ambassadors. And of course, we wanted them to be good travel companions too, right? And so the end result was female predominant faculty for the last several years at our international ICEG meetings. I will point out, actually, this is Dr. Gilmore's husband. We had an all-female faculty there, and two of the men in the pictures here in Bogota, Mexico City, were our local hosts. It probably tells you something about gender diversity in South America. But this is just an example of the success and how we don't need to feel bad about all-female symposia. And of course, I don't want to ignore the men of ACNS. I've personally, I know Sarah would say the same thing, have had tremendous colleagues and mentors throughout the years. It wouldn't be where I was without personal mentorship from Chip Epstein and Kim Metter. But I will say sometimes they need a little bit of education and perspective. So in 2018, the International Congress of Clinical Neurophysiology was held and hosted by ACNS in DC. And there were male colleagues that were promoting in a session on continuous EEG monitoring and targeted temperature management. There were colleagues that were promoting the tradition of nipple pinching as the preferred method of testing reactivity in coma patients. And a thank you to Dr. Sarah Smith, was the one woman in the audience who stood up and challenged this, citing that this is a potential form of sexual assault. Now, this led to a lot of tense conversations, both within that session and one-on-one. But in the end, the result was there was agreement among the leadership that nipple pinching is not an appropriate method of evaluating activity in coma. And in fact, a recent survey, this was 1 year before that, but showed that there was only one center in North America that was utilizing nipple pressure. So I think this is important. And then also a kudos to Sarah, the importance of the change that an individual can make amongst our society. I've not heard one mention of nipple pinching since that 2018 society meeting. And then finally, so how do we get more women? We talked about the pathway, how we need to get more women into speaking roles so that they can rise up to leadership. And so I think that's where the importance of mentorship and sponsorship comes in. And so with sponsorship being kind of a relatively new concept, we need both, okay? Both are very important, but just kind of a compare and contrast. Mentorship is a little bit more passive process where sponsorship is active. With sponsorship, the sponsor provides direct opportunities as opposed to the mentor suggesting opportunities. The mentor provides advice, a sponsor provides direct advocacy for the protege. And although mentorship can be short or long-term, sponsorships tend to be longer term. They're higher risk. As a sponsor, you're putting a junior faculty person out there and promoting them. You're putting your reputation on the line, but at the same time, there's much higher reward in that. And I personally felt that level of reward from sponsorship of junior faculty. And I think it's important to note too, I think Sarah mentioned this, especially in this day and age where people are a Zoom phone call away, that mentorship and sponsorship can cross department and institutional barriers. So look outside of your department, even outside of your institution, for who might be possibly the best mentor and sponsor for you. And so then there's just some basics of sponsorship, is particularly in regards to meetings, is women can call on other women to encourage them to participate. You can let other junior faculty women in your meeting group or the audience know in advance that you want them to participate or to comment. Sarah talked about the importance of citing accomplishments more than personality traits, particularly for women, and not to raise doubt raising comments. But I think most importantly is just to directly provide opportunity. I know for myself personally, when I'm offered an opportunity to speak, be part of a committee, write a paper, if it's something that I can't do due to scheduling or bandwidth, the first thing that I'm going to do is recommend another female for that opportunity. And I will keep doing that until the gender gap goes the other direction, okay? Until we get rid of the gender gap. And then finally, men have been had their lineages for years and years and years. We read in the medical history books about Dr. X who trained Dr. Y, who trained Dr. Z, and all the importance of this lineage. But I really think we need to have this for women too. So these are just some of the most important female colleagues in my life. I've been very fortunate to have this direct sponsorship of many women, and kind of turned around and paid that forward to more junior colleagues. And really, the end result of this, Sarah talked about burnout, but then you build, it's not just professional genealogy, it's a professional family. And I found that there's no greater antidote to burnout than to having these, these close professional and personal relationships. And then, of course, my last picture, I just want to pay tribute to the one person who probably did more for gender equity than anyone else in our lifetime, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I will close with that. And I just noticed I didn't leave much time for questions, and I apologize for that. But.
No, that was amazing. Both of you guys, thank you so much. I'm so glad I'm recording this. I wasn't sure I should, but it was amazing. You really covered like so many different topics. Do people have a few questions they want to ask? You can unmute yourselves, or there's been some in here typing. People have been typing sort of interesting things. When Benjamin Kay said that study where the duration of the visit was slightly longer for female physicians, I believe I've read that, and it's not due to any kind of difference in their field or their subspecialty, correct?
No, it was mostly a group of family medicine and internal medicine physicians. That was the specialty that was overwhelmingly represented in that study.
I don't know.
There wasn't they gave you that data in the study, which I cited.
Any other questions from the participants? You can unmute yourselves, I think, hopefully.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'll turn my video on too. Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a PGY5 child neurology resident. Thank you all for your great talks. I have two questions. One of them, the slide that talks about when females are parents with the pay gap, just how women are treated differently when they are parents. I guess, do you have any recommendations for navigating like that? Or like, if any of you have when you were pregnant, did you like tell your boss in advance, or like, how did you guys approach having children in residency? And then another question is, when I eventually, start looking for an attending position, what is the best way you think it is to get a pulse on what it's like for the women in the department, and like what the environment is?
I think, it's always important when you're doing your interview process. First of all, it's always telling to me if they set up a series of interviews and none of the people that you're meeting with are women. That's always its own sort of subject of concern for me, because to me, that suggests to me that there either is insufficient representation of women in your area or insufficient representation of women in leadership. And to me, both things are a little bit concerning. But I think it's very important to, talk in person, have a somewhat candid conversation, if only during the interview process, because when interviewing for an attending position, you usually will meet with a battery of people. It's usually a pretty hefty number. I mean, I'm thinking back to my own experiences, because I interviewed at several places before accepting my first job and then my most recent job. And it should give you enough opportunity so that you can find a comfortable environment to ask about things. Paid time off, what's the policy for taking off unexpectedly? Because I think sooner or later, there's going to come a situation when you need to take time off with little notice. And I think you need to find out a little bit about what your departmental policies are for that.
and what kind of departmental support there is for that, finding out if there's any kind of institutional support for daycare. I think all of those things are important.
Yeah, I would concur with that, having just been through an interview process myself for my next position. If there are not women on your list to talk to, then look at the department list and ask to meet with some other women. So maybe there's no women in the division that you're joining, but look at the rest of the department and ask if you can meet with people outside your division, particularly if there's a full professor or a woman of leadership outside. And most of the time I found too, on the one-on-one interviews, people want a good fit, right? They don't want you to come there and find out later, oh, this is not what I thought it was. And so just frankly on the one-on-one inside the room say, and I've said this to women, so just off the record, tell me what it's like here. How do you feel? Are you respected? How does decisions get made here? Those types of things. And then also many departments these days have a committee or task force for diversity and inclusion. I think that speaks volumes if they at least have that. And I ask to speak to the director of the task force of diversity and inclusion to see what they're working on.
I think being in child neurology, it would be very, very hard to find a division that didn't have a fair number of women, because we are one of the subspecialties that's robustly women oriented. But I do think it's tricky to feel like your direct boss, you may not want to say, well, I'm thinking about having 3 more kids to your direct boss. I, of course, always respond, great. But I think that, you could find somebody else to talk about that with if you're uncomfortable with it. Like there is somebody to talk to about that for sure.
Yeah. And, some of this information also, if you're really uncomfortable about having these conversations, you can get the basics of the information online. And then use that as a springboard for your conversations also. So, every major institution is going to have their maternity policy published. That's going to be public domain. So you can look that up beforehand, just and use that as a springboard for conversation. You can work that into a conversation about benefits. What's your policy on short-term disability? What's your policy on long-term disability? If it makes you more comfortable so that it doesn't seem like, this is so obvious, I'm clearly planning on having a child. If you want to do that, that's fine. But really, it's also kind of none of their business whether or not you choose to have more children or happen to have more children.
Agree. We're past due. So this was so wonderful. I thank you both so much. And we need to work on the Child Neurology Society, I believe, looking at your little charts there for ACNS. So we'll keep that in mind. Thank you guys again.
Thank you so much, Brenda.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Bye.